Hi, Mary, how are you this afternoon? Can you hear me now?
I can, and it's great to be here. It's wonderful,
Awesome.
actually.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and welcome everybody that's just tuned in here on Facebook Live and YouTube. If you're watching on Facebook Live, definitely check out our YouTube feed there as well. You can look it up, just Anthony Welty, or even Welty for Wa, or as the sign says behind me, Be Free, Vote Welty, and you can find those on YouTube. But welcome everybody to Be Free TV, where we'll be talking about freedom and how freedom-based solutions to these government-manufactured issues can make the lives of the average everyday person just so much better. We've been focusing on topics that affect insurance, as I'm running for state insurance commissioner, and a lot of healthcare, since that's obviously a popular topic this day and age. And I'm excited today to be joined by Miss Dr. Mary Ruwart. She's a retired biomedical researcher, libertarian activist, has run for vice president, and an author of a couple of books as well. I'm sure she would love to fill you in on some of those books here shortly. I do encourage you to go find them on Amazon. I think I'm short one myself, but Dr. Ruwart, thank you so much for joining me today. I am blessed to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I really enjoy doing these. It's so nice to do it from home. And the other book, of course, is Healing Our World, which is the book most people know me from. It came out in the early 90s and has a 2015 edition, and I think it still is the most comprehensive, I guess is the word, comprehensive compilation of how liberty works in the real world. Because if it doesn't work in the real world, we're not going to be too excited about it. But of course it does, because it's our ethical and moral imperative as humans. It helps us survive and thrive.
Yeah, I've heard excellent things about that one. I'll be honest, I have not read it yet. I have the other two. I do need to get Healing Our Worlds. Mary, you are a wealth of knowledge. So many libertarians that are going to be tuning into this have heard you speak. They've read your writing, and then others that are not political in nature and have never even really listened to libertarians speak. You guys are in for a treat today. Dr. Ruwart has a vast amount of experience. Why don't you just give us a brief overview of who Dr. Mary Ruwart is, what your background is, and tell everybody why I'm so excited to hear you.
Okay, well, as you mentioned, I was a research scientist for many years, for a few years in academia, and then for 19 years in the pharmaceutical firm, the Upjohn Company. And so I learned firsthand about the FDA and how it really, it's hard to even explain. It's taken 5 to 10 years off each of our lives. And you can actually calculate the 5 years from published studies by other people other than myself, and just put them together and find out that the 10-year delay in getting a drug from the lab bench to the marketplace has caused a lot of people, including AIDS patients, to die waiting for drugs. And if you watch the Dallas Buyers Club movie, which is an award-winning movie, you saw how the FDA prosecuted and persecuted sick people who were just trying to save their lives by getting unapproved drugs, getting drugs from other countries, taking nutritional supplements. It was really very, very sad. In fact, what's really sad about it is a lot of those things seem to have been helpful. And of course, innovation has been just squashed because when you add 10 years to the development time of drugs, which used to be about 4 years back in the early 60s, you have costs that increase every year. In fact, 80% of what we pay at the pharmacy are due to drugs that, regulatory demands by the FDA for these drugs. And they don't increase safety at all. In fact, safety before the early 60s, when the FDA got its teeth with the 1962 amendments, we withdrew about 2.5% of the drugs that were FDA approved for the market. Now we actually withdraw more, 3.3%. So we're actually not getting safer drugs to market. So everything that was promised by these regulations has been costly in terms of lives and in money, and we haven't gained anything. So it's really very sad.
So let's back up just for a second there, because you said something that I think is significant. And under the pretext that, government is here to protect you, right? We've all heard that quote, "Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to protect you." And the FDA is good. Mary, where would we be without the FDA? But you said something a moment ago about the number of drugs that had been withdrawn pre and post. Can you highlight that again and elaborate maybe?
Sure. Well, we just don't know enough science to be able to always predict which drugs are going to have negative effects in some subpopulations of people. So, we do clinical testing in humans and do the best we can to figure out what could go wrong. But frankly, our knowledge just isn't good enough. So when a lot of people take these drugs, it turns out that some people are very susceptible to side effects. And so if it's enough people, we withdraw the drug from the market, even after it's been FDA approved. And before the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act, which were passed in the early 60s, before they were passed, we withdrew about 2.5% of the drugs from the market for safety reasons, after they were approved. But after the amendments came, it was worse, not better. It was 3.3%, which probably isn't that different from 2.5%. It's a small number. But the bottom line is the promise of the amendments was that number would go down, and it has not gone down. So that's really bad. And in the meantime, instead of having 4 years, we've gone to 14 years. We have people dying waiting. We have exorbitant costs, and they go up exponentially every year. So it's not just 1 year. These amendments really empowered the FDA to put more and more regulations on each year. And so what ends up happening is every year, the cost of getting FDA approval goes up tremendously. And so obviously the cost of the drug at the pharmacy has to go up. And even so, only about 2 to 3 drugs out of 10 that make it to the market. And I'm talking about new drugs now. I'm not talking about like formulations. So only 2 out of 3 drugs actually even make up their development costs. So the whole industry now is skating, so to speak, on the blockbuster drugs. And if we stop getting blockbuster drugs, we will stop the industry cold, which is pretty scary.
It is scary because, as much as, big pharma, for a lot of good reasons, can get a bad rap. Ultimately, science and medicine and technologies is making the lives of Americans and making the lives of everybody around the world better. The last thing we want to do is restrict that, glorious innovation and healing. My goodness. So the FDA is slowing things down. They're making it more expensive, and then they're still having to backpedal at a higher rate than they had been prior to the FDA really exploding in power.
Probably the right way to say it is it hasn't gotten any better, because I'm not sure the 2.5% is different than 3.3%, but still it's going in the wrong direction. So that's clear. And, with this whole coronavirus thing, the same thing. The FDA knew the coronavirus was coming. We all knew the coronavirus was coming, right? And so what ended up happening was the private sector was gearing up with tests and protective gear and things like this. But the FDA said, wait, no, we're not going to allow that. Only the CDC's test can be used. We're not going to allow any imports. We're not going to allow any private domestic manufacturers to put their tests out there. And they had similar things going on for protective gear for our healthcare workers. So they were having to reuse disposable healthcare products, which is ridiculous. And so we went 6 weeks without a test because guess what? The CDC's didn't work. So that was, so we couldn't tell who was sick. Really, I mean, who's sick from the regular flu, who's sick from the coronavirus flu. So we couldn't quarantine those people or ask them to stay home. Also, we didn't have protective gear so that when you went out, especially those who were at risk, could put some protective gear on. We didn't have hand sanitizers either because even though the whiskey distillers said, hey, we can make hand sanitizers, we've got lots of alcohol. The FDA said, no, you can't do that unless you're putting poison into the hand sanitizer because somebody might drink it since it's ethanol instead of isopropanol. And if they had done that, if the manufacturers had put this additive in, it would have basically made it impossible to clean their machinery and they never could use it for distilling again. And I think a lot of them went ahead anyhow. And I'm kind of glad they did because we need those hand sanitizers. But if we didn't have protective gear, hand sanitizers, and tests, what were we going to do? What was left? Mm-hmm. The social distancing, which is destroying the economy. We've got about 20% unemployment right now. And there's going to be a lot of jobs that aren't going to be there to go back to.
Yeah, a lot of lives permanently hurt. And, libertarians, and you've written a whole book about this, libertarians, sometimes we get a bad rap for, oh, you just want people to die, right? You want the FDA to go away. And you don't think that we should, make safe choices to stop a pandemic. And that just couldn't be further from the truth because it's really the existing system, as Dr. Ruwart here just highlighted, that is making a bad situation worse, where freedom would have allowed quicker response times and more flexibility. I talk about that a lot. In my race for insurance commissioners, we have to allow flexibility to embrace our diversity, right? There's going to be diverse needs, there's diverse desires, diverse situations. And if we have top-down control from a federal organization, it's impossible to be nimble. Yes, that is so true. And this is exactly what happened. The private sector geared up. The FDA said no. And of course, a lot of them probably geared down and never got back into the game. And then when the FDA finally said, okay, you can import. Yeah. you can use something other than the CDC's tests. Well, some of them geared up again, but I have to imagine that many did not, because, and actually, even after the FDA said that, they said, well, you don't even have to tell us about it for 2 weeks about 15 days, 2 weeks. And then these manufacturers are making home tests, send them out, hundreds of them. And the FDA said, well, no, you have to recall all that. You cannot give people the results because they might not know how to do a nasal swab. And, maybe they wouldn't, but a lot of them would. And found out they had coronavirus and would have stayed home. It's just ridiculous. There is such a thing as overregulation, and we are smack in the middle of it. Really, the 1960s, early 1960s, I think the FDA had all the power it needed to stop anything. And they, but this unwieldy thing it's become, it's very difficult. And I mean, I could talk about this for hours because I've just given you the tip of the iceberg. Well, you speak to your heart's content. The folks that are listening in right now, they're tired of hearing me talk anyways. I've been running for office for 2.5 years out here in Washington. It's about time somebody like Dr. Ruwart comes on and shows people what's really up. But, in all reality, folks, and I do appreciate you turning in. If you haven't started a watch party yet, now's your opportunity to do it. Go ahead and pop up some questions. We'll try to get to those as we get through the conversation. We'll have about another half hour here or so with Dr. Ruwart, and I just appreciate you guys joining the conversation. The things that I've been talking about, um, are important because they're going to make healthcare more accessible. It's going to make healthcare more affordable. And anytime regulation, even under the guise of safety, anytime you have regulation, it inherently restricts the flow of goods and services. Now, under the pretext of it's making us safer, maybe that's a trade-off some are willing to take. As Dr. Ruwart highlighted, it isn't making us safer. It's actually making us less safe. We had companies here in Washington. Actually, you mentioned the alcohol dispensaries or distilleries. We had a company here in Washington, and they were ready to go. Had to pump the brakes a little bit. Eventually, got up to speed, and now quickly are already, I think, selling their last set of bottles because they're moving on. But they were willing to work right as they realized they had the ability to help, and they were told no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So Dr. Jo Jorgensen running for the Libertarian nominee, she is the Libertarian nominee for president. I got to change how we say that now. She mentioned something on this note the other day in an interview too, where I'm going to butcher the number here. I think it was 50 or 60 different American companies were manufacturing different forms of the test, and
Yes.
only 2 of them were allowed to do business in America, and the other 58 are still conducting business around the world.
Yeah, there are a lot of tests that are here, different tests in this country, and not all of them come from the U.S. I mean, in early January, a German company had given 250,000 kits to the World Health Organization. Clearly, they know how to produce them, and we could have gotten test kits and been on top of the curve. We still really are just finding out enough about this virus to actually even make any rational decisions because we didn't have testing. Countries that did have a lot of testing, for example, South Korea, they were able to keep their death rates low. But one of the things I'd like to point out to your listeners, because this virus it's still out there, it's going to be out there for a long time. And the people who are at risk, of course, are the elderly, those with cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity. These are all what we call diseases of silent inflammation. And it turns out the coronavirus is able to kind of get a positive feedback cycle going on inflammation. This may be why these people are so susceptible. Knowing that, you can protect yourself to a great extent by taking not anti-inflammatory drugs per se, but you can kind of beef up your own body's defense against things like that. Of course, obviously, the first thing you need to do is not be in one of those categories if you can avoid it. So,
one can hope.
Yeah, in many cases that means losing weight or exercising or doing the things you should do to be healthy. But beyond that, there are a couple things you can do. One, an anti-inflammatory diet, and that is the Zone Diet. You can go to zonediet.com and learn more about it. Dr. Barry Steers, who designed it, is somebody that I personally know and can recommend. And then the other thing is to make sure your body is have enough antioxidant molecules and things of this nature, vitamin E, vitamin C, and if you want to learn more about those kind of things, I highly recommend lifeextension.com. Life Extension's been around a long time. It's run by a couple libertarians. In fact,
there we go.
They were the first libertarians the first supplement manufacturers to win in court against the FDA. They were trying to put both of them in prison for bringing coenzyme Q into this country. Coenzyme Q10 it's when you take a statin, your doctor gives you this nutrient, CoQ10, to prevent the side effects of the statin. I mean, this is a big thing. And the FDA said, no, you can't sell that. It's a prescription drug in Japan, so it's an unapproved drug here. And they fought for 8 years. even though their lawyers said you cannot win, you are going to prison, you might as well negotiate with the FDA and see if you can kind of put your term down. And they said, no way, we're fighting. And they won. And it's really
Wow.
changed a lot about the way the FDA was handling supplement manufacturers and health food stores, because they were doing basically SWAT team raids.
Mm-hmm.
My physician, Dr. Jonathan Wright, who's out in your area.
Yep. Tahoma Clinic.
Yes, one of the people who was raided. Yes, yes.
Wow. Because people want to help heal others. That's the travesty beyond it all, is that it's the state force preventing people from trying to help others. Like that is the lowest of the low.
It is when you see all of the things they've done to make people suffer. And it's because they have this idea. I mean, in a way, I have to empathize with them, because there is one thing that happens. So if something goes wrong with a drug and people complain, Congress beats up on the FDA and says, why did you approve that drug? Well, as I said before, they can't help it because our science just isn't good enough to always get the right answer. So their response to that is to try to sit there and think, okay, now what other study can we do? So we might find some strange things. So if we get called on the carpet by Congress, it's not too bad. We can say, oh, we did our due diligence. We made them do 14 years of experiments, So it's really sad, because one of the things the 1962 amendments did was made somebody at the FDA sign on the dotted line, it's okay to approve this drug. So they had to put their head in the proverbial noose. It's really, you can see how counterproductive it is.
Yeah. So now it's the self-interest in protecting their own ass, which
Exactly.
is human nature. I mean, I do it. I do whatever I can to protect myself and make sure I'm not out of a job. Yeah, which is what's unfortunate when we empower them more and more year after year after year. So I had a couple thoughts that I wanted to kind of pick your brain about. So
Sure.
What are other countries doing better than America when it comes to this topic of keeping medicine safe?
That's a good question. Well, every country has different regulations, but one of the things that was good about the European Union, now there's a lot of things that are bad, but one of the good things was they decided they would all follow one script, basically, on how drugs get approved. So it was very easy that once you approved in one country, the other countries pretty much followed, which is a good thing. Now, the Europeans do something else that's good. They have a different way of approving medical devices. I've told you how bad it is for drugs. It's worse for medical devices. If you could even believe this, we don't get life-saving medical devices here first. They get them in Europe first. And part of that is because they have a private agency that helps the companies prepare their package for the regulators. And it's a private it's kind of like a certification almost. And once the company passes that certification with this private certifier, usually the regulators kind of rubber stamp the approval for the medical devices. And so that's a very good thing, because honestly, our medical devices, I mean, they're invented here, but they're approved first in Europe. and some of them are very life-saving. Like, of course, women have a lot of breast cancer. So one ingenious person in Illinois found out that if you had just a silicone pad and put it over your breast when you were examining your breast, you could feel little lumps that you might not otherwise feel. Very simple. Well, the FDA wouldn't approve it here for many, many years, because they were afraid that it would give women a false sense of security if they put this pad on and then, felt and didn't find anything. But the alternative is women have to just do it themselves, right? Without any device to help them. That's going to be a lot worse. So it's just the reasoning. It's just sometimes it's hard to get around the reasoning.
So you're saying that the private industry in that situation is basically just trying to make the medical device companies trying to make their life easier when it comes to getting stuff approved. And would you think that an organization of that nature would be a safe regulator if that last checks and balances, that government agency, wasn't there?
Yeah, actually, what's amazing to me is that a lot of private organizations that are of citizens, no medical background, right? These are just ordinary citizens, have done better than the FDA. Let me tell you a little story about the Abigail Alliance. So Abigail was a young lady. I think she was 18 or 19 years old, and she wanted to take a drug that was in development, had not yet been approved, because it was specific for her type of cancer. The FDA said no until the very last minute, which was too late for her. So her father got really upset, as you might imagine. So he's founded this Abigail Alliance, and what they do is they're kind of a watchdog for the FDA. They look at studies, cancer studies of drugs that are supposed to be anti-cancer, and they evaluate them. And in the past 10 years or so, they have pointed out that there are 40 drugs that the FDA approved that they had written letters to the FDA about and said, hey, this drug works, you need to approve it, an average of 2 years before the FDA actually approved it.
Wow.
Now, if a consumer's agency can see that the drug is working, what is stopping the FDA? Well, one of the things that was stopping the FDA is that one of the examiners, in fact, I think it was the head of the oncology unit, I'm not quite sure the title, he said, no, we can't approve any drug unless you do a lifetime study and show these people live longer. Well, of course, that takes longer than right? So then his wife got cancer. And she had trouble getting into some of these studies because they're very restrictive, right? And they can only let so many people in. And he did a complete about face after his wife died. He says, and I'm going to use his word, I am on a jihad to get these drugs approved.
Wow.
And so it's been a complete about face, once it happens to them.
Yep.
Okay. But now here's some good news for us as libertarians. If you look at my book, Death by Regulation, where I use these other studies to show that the FDA has taken at least 5 years off each of our lives, and probably more like 10, and I explain why I added that on in the book. What you realize is that it's not just like you and I that are losing 5 to 10 years of our lives. It's Congress. It's the FDA regulators. It's the president. It's everybody. And the thing about that, since we're all interested in self-interest, right? We just talked about that earlier.
Yep.
If we could show that to the regulators, if we could show that to Congress, if we could show that to the FDA, self-interest might kick in and we may get some changes.
Might be the one time we want the Congress people to have self-interest, because so far all they have is self-interest and no interest for others. That's unfortunate. Wow. And getting out of the way and allowing people to care for one another, again, back to that, like I said a few seconds ago, right? We can care for each other. We have cared for each other already, and we can again when it comes to keeping each other safe from medications. And there's lots of different organizations out there. People have different opinions about all of them, right? Whether it's the what's the American Medical Association or the Pediatrics Association, right? There's lots of different organizations. I'm sure you could list 100 of them off the top of your head. And each one of those could theoretically bring value to somebody. And with today's technology age, and you can, quickly get on your keyboard, look something up, go look at 4 different, associations reviews on a cancer drug, maybe make a phone call, and then all of a sudden you'd have that information without the FDA slowing down the process.
Well, actually, before the FDA got its teeth, so to speak, there was a lot of this going on. The American Medical Association actually tested drugs themselves. And, they evaluated them. There are publications now that are dedicated to doing their own review on the drugs. And, so this is really great. And these are, of course, professionals as opposed to the citizens that I talked about earlier. But, we've got desperate people, even today, trying to make the drugs that are in development in their kitchens, because they're so desperate. And this is what the AIDS patients did. They hired black market chemists to make the drugs we were working on in the industry. And of course, because people get resistant to these drugs, by the time the FDA gave us permission to test in people, Every eighth patient in the country that wanted these drugs had already had them and were resistant. We had to wait until, there were new diagnosed people that we could actually enroll in our trials.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Costing lives every step of the way, just one on top of another, man. So one of the solutions that I've talked about is, importing medication, right? If the medication here isn't affordable, where can we get it where it is? With your knowledge background on medicine and these drugs, would you feel safe importing medications from another country?
Well, I would feel, safety isn't really the issue. Like, we could import them from Canada, for example, but their population is much smaller than ours. So if we did that, we'd wipe out their entire stock.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an issue and it's a problem. And in theory, our FDA does not allow other countries, allow us to import from other countries unless they go through an FDA inspection, their manufacturing plant. But of course, that doesn't always happen because the FDA is not big enough to do all this. This is the thing. The FDA has taken on so much, it's impossible to do. So even when we're talking about drugs in the US, it's not, the manufacturers know the drill, right? So they're going to try very hard to make sure everything's right, because if they get an inspection and they have a problem, it's very costly. But, the FDA really can't monitor things like they want to. And like one of the things when we were talking about earlier about them trying to shut down the supplement manufacturers if they crossed any lines at all. Today with the internet, it's hard for the FDA to police everything that's said on the internet. And that's probably a good thing because people are learning about how they can take care of themselves. Because one of the things these 62 amendments did, it made it impossible for supplement or natural food products manufacturers to make health claims, because if they do, and they haven't jumped through the 14 years of regulatory hoops, then the FDA can prosecute them. You can't make a health claim.
Let's touch on that health claim thing. I know there's probably a few people tuning in right now that are aware of some of the issues. Like you can't say like vitamin C keeps you healthy, right? Give us a little background on what you can and can't say in that respect.
Yes, well, you can't make, I said a health claim, I should have said a disease claim. You can't say that it prevents or treats disease usually. And this was a real problem because, folic acid, a B vitamin, is very, very helpful in preventing horrific birth defects, spina bifida and such things.
So I have to excuse myself, Mary. So everybody, I'm in a travel trailer and we just got a giant windstorm that came through. Mary, do you mind riffing for just a second? Do you mind? This is an emergency.
I can tell the story and you can go.
Yes, I'll be right back. 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, no problem. So we knew that folic acid in the early 1980s could prevent these horrific birth defects if the woman took them in the first month or two of pregnancy, when she might not even know she's pregnant. But the FDA told the folic acid manufacturers if they talked about this, which was published in scientific journals, that they would be prosecuted. Well, in the early 90s, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, another government agency, started recommending that women of childbearing potential take a dose of folic acid as a preventative. And then what ended up happening is the FDA said to the folic acid manufacturers, if you even talk about the CDC's recommendation, we'll prosecute you. So here in the US, we had a lot of babies born needlessly with these neural tube defects, is what they're called, spina bifida being one of them. And so the FDA started telling grain manufacturers that they had to supplement all of their grain products like bread, cereals, with folic acid. But of course, the woman never knew if she got the right dose or not. It takes a very specific dose to make sure that you prevent these birth defects. And so we still had birth defects here in the US, whereas, for example, in Denmark, where the government said, we're going to talk about this all the time and encourage the manufacturers to do so too, the birth defects went down. So according to my calculations, we may have had 10,000 children born with these birth defects needlessly, and maybe as many as twice that many, if you count the ones that were aborted, because you can test for this in utero. So this is very sad, and this has continued to this day. If you find that a vitamin or mineral can prevent something, it's very, very hard for the manufacturer to make a claim, because these substances don't have any patent protection. Now, when I first joined the industry, we were still developing drugs without patents because the full effect of the amendments hadn't kicked in yet. But today, no one will touch a drug or a substance, even if it's a natural substance, without patent protection, because there's no way that the manufacturers can make up their development costs when only 2 or 3 out of 10 are making it anyway. You can see that that just wouldn't work. Of course, if we just said, too bad, no patents, the whole industry would shut down, and I think there'd be a hue and cry from the American public. So, there's some reasons to think about doing it that way too. And let's see, I'm going to look and see if I can see some of the questions, so I can. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous, so I appreciate that. And if anyone wants to put a question in there, go ahead and I'll try to address it. In the meantime, I'll talk a little more about the coronavirus, since that's really on everybody's mind. There's a lot of things we don't know yet. But I was talking a little earlier about, beefing up your own system so that if you are in one of these other groups, or, just you're older, like I am, you can have some protection. Some of the things that we're noticing is that as you get older, things like your nitric oxide levels go down, and you can test for nitric oxide levels with little strips, saliva strips that you can buy on Amazon. And there are nutrients that you can take to boost your nitric oxide, and they're natural substances. Arginine is one, citrulline is another. So there's things you can do to up your body's natural defense against all this.
Hi, Dr. Ruwart, and everybody tuning in. I sincerely apologize. I'm having a household emergency here on the campaign trail. I will have to end this call here, otherwise my trailer is going to see a significant impact to it. I will send a post later and fill everybody in. Thank you, Dr. Mary Ruwart, for joining us. I have to go, though. I sincerely apologize, everybody.
That's okay. If you need me back again so we can finish, I'm happy to do that.
I might take you up on that. God bless. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay. Bye, everyone.